Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we've discontinued our in-person events and instituted these online webinars, which we've been doing since the 1st of June. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our Mexican staff. You can donate at our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Global Justice Center, for those in the UK or Canada, that's center spelled C-E-N-T-E-R. Today, we have a special program on a topic that we've had several requests to cover. As the US presidency changes this week from Republican to Democratic hands, the big spending Republicans are predictably becoming deficit hawks, calling for austerity. Yet massive federal spending is needed to stimulate the economy and provide relief to individuals, small businesses, state and local governments. President-elect Biden has already announced a $1.9 trillion program. But where can the money come from? The major economies of the world have been plunged into a deep slump by the COVID pandemic. Governments have been forced to spend heavily to keep businesses afloat and to support households. Government deficits are at record highs, and public sector debt is at record levels. If mass evacuation curbs COVID in this year, should governments stop spending to balance their books and reduce debt, as some say? Or should budget deficits be made permanent, as modern monetary theory suggests? Is MMT the way out of the crisis? In the financial crisis of 2008, the Federal Reserve came up with trillions of dollars to bail out the banks. Again, last year, when COVID closed down much of the economy, the federal government came up with trillions more in relief money. Yet this massive deficit spending has not resulted in inflation. How is this possible? Modern monetary theory offers an answer. Our speaker today, Michael Roberts, who we're fortunate to have with us, is a Marxist economist who has worked in the City of London for over 40 years as an economist, as well as in various financial institutions. He's author of several books: The Great Recession, A Marxist View, published in 2009, The Long Depression in 2016, World in Crisis, 2018 book, Marx 200 in 2018, and Engels 200 in 2020. As you can see, he's had quite a stream of books in recent years. He's published many papers in various journals and presented at many conferences, including Historical Materialism, the International Initiative for the Promotion of Political Economy, and the American Economics Association. He's been visiting lecturer at the SOAS London, at the UNAM Mexico City, That's the National Autonomous University of Mexico, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and the Technical University of Lisbon, among others. He has a popular blog under his pseudonym, Michael Roberts, and that is at thenextrecession.wordpress.com, if you're not already familiar with it. I know that some of you who are with us today are. Well, without any further introduction, I want to turn the floor over to Michael Roberts, who is coming to us thanks to the magic of the internet from England. Okay, take it away, Michael.
Thank you very much, Cliff, and thank you for the Centre of Global Justice inviting me to speak on this important subject at a very appropriate time, as Cliff said, with just 2 days to go before the Donald has to retire, screaming and yelling and being dragged out of the White House and replaced by a Democratic Party president, Joe Biden, who, as Cliff has said, has already announced a big program, and it is big program, of fiscal stimulus package to be introduced during 2021. Part of that program, which I'll briefly go to in a minute, is about trying to help businesses in particular, but also people and local governments to get through the continuation of the lockdowns and the pandemic slump until the vaccinations arrive. But it's also about trying to develop and expand the economy through fiscal spending, government spending, and in particular infrastructure spending. How is that going to be paid for is exactly the question that Cliff has asked, and exactly what this discussion is about. Is there a way to pay for this, as it were, without avoiding and also avoiding either inflation or a huge debt crisis down the road? So I'm just going to show you a few graphs in order to explain my position. I like to do graphs if I can. So the title of my short presentation here is to contrast modern monetary theory with Marxist monetary theory. So 2 M's and a theory on both sides. And I'm going to argue for you that the great benefits of the ideas of modern monetary theory are not going to be enough to achieve the objectives that we've got as working class people and the labour movement to achieve social need, not only in the US, but across other parts of the world. And as Cliff said, we have a Biden stimulus package coming up, 1.9 trillion, with direct stimulus payments to individuals, likely that we'll be able to raise those paychecks from $600, as announced under the previous Republican majority Congress, to another extra $1,400, extra aid to state and local governments, extension of the emergency jobless benefits, money for the vaccinations, testing and tracing, child tax credit, and so on, and also the $15 an hour minimum wage, which the new administration is apparently pledged to. All I could briefly say, some of these points, they look great. They're not as good as they sound, because the aid to state and local governments is about half what state and local governments need. The $15 hour minimum wage is really still very low. And in fact, there's no way going to restore the level of minimum wage relative to average wages that existed, say, 10, 15, or 20 years ago. It's only a mild step forward. And there's no indication from the administration that's going to be immediately introduced. It could be phased in over the period of this particular term of office for the president. A number of other measures fall short of what is really needed. But nevertheless, it's a significant stimulus package. And alongside that is probably another extra $1 trillion, which is going to be invested over the next period of the administration, 4 years, in what's called Build Back Better recovery plan, with procurement investment to buy American products, plus another $300 billion for R&D and breakthrough technology investment electrical vehicle technology and so on, and accelerated investment in building and repairing the roads, which are in a shocking and sorry state in the US. By the way, it's not confined to the US. If you come here, the bridges and potholes in the UK can match anything that the US has got. And if you go into Europe, Italy regularly has its bridges falling down because of the lack of public investment in the basic infrastructure that's gone on. And on top of that, of course, we have the daring need for action on environmental investment in green power, solar, wind, and so on, upgrading buildings, energy efficiency, and so on. These are all part of the program of the infrastructure plan, to some extent presented by the Biden presidency for his term of office. And yet, this cannot, the old argument used to be, you spend the money and you tax people to pay for it, and you keep the budget more or less in balance. But of course, what's happened over the last 50 years, and particularly in the last 30 years, there's been a dramatic reduction in the average tax rates, particularly for the rich. Here's an indication of how fast corporate taxes have fallen as a share of the tax rate, and individual income taxes for the top 1% of income earners. So successive presidents, both Democratic and Republican, have been cutting corporate taxes, cutting income taxes, cutting property taxes, all mainly to the benefit of the richest part of the community. And of course, that means that there isn't the resource or the government revenues coming through from taxation to pay for necessary public investment, vital public investment and spending on things. So the COVID-19 crisis left countries and administrations like the US, but also in Europe, with failing health systems, weakened public services as a result of cuts in taxes combined with the austerity programs of cuts in spending. And so when the pandemic hit it, many of these countries are unable to meet the needs of people in this situation and avoid the disasters that we've had over the last years. But nevertheless, here is the indication of how far the new president-elect is going to be pumping up fiscal policy. As you can see, the Biden fiscal policy, the orange bar here, is going to add a considerable amount towards existing COVID relief and the CARES Act already introduced by previous administration. That's a massive increase in the percentage of 2019 GDP in government spending if it's implemented in full. That's probably unlikely, but even so, it's going to be a lot more heading up towards this level of 20% of GDP. Way more, in fact, than most other countries around in the major economies. So how is this fiscal spending, if it's going to be introduced, to be paid for? Particularly when we have a huge rise in public debt across the board in most countries. This is the US public debt, which you can see had already been exceeding so-called debt ceilings that's set by Congress, and now with COVID has rocketing out of the sight towards well over the, heading towards 110% of annual US nominal GDP by the end of this year at the moment, and will be staying up there for some time ahead, particularly with these extra spendings coming through. And the usual argument is presented, well, you've got that level of debt, you're going to have huge costs servicing it, you need to bring that debt down. That was the argument made after the Great Recession in 2008-9. The moderate fiscal spending conducted by the Obama administration, the aim was to bring that back, to drag it back. And that will probably be, as Cliff has said, a siren call from some in the Congress over the next period that they can't have this level of debt. It's got to be paid for. We've got to balance the books and reduce that debt that cost us going forward. And it's not just in the US. Here's an indication of a huge change in debt to GDP across the board for most countries in the world as a result of COVID. Look at where Canada's increase in debt is taking place. This combines government debt, corporate debt, and household debt, the three areas here. And you can see a huge increase in government debt, the green bars across the board here. But even corporate debt has been increasing sharply in the last year, and household debt too in many countries. So there's a huge burden of debt. And what does debt mean? Debt means people are, as it were, sacrificing future earnings. They're anticipating future earnings and income in order to meet the demands of the immediate crisis at the moment, with the hope that with growth that comes back, they will be able to service this debt and perhaps reduce it over time. But nevertheless, we're reaching particularly large figures. The highest figures we've seen since the middle of the 20th century, and in many cases even more. So does this mean that we are now in a position that we are going to be forced to return to austerity in order to bring debt back? Well, the argument goes as follows, that modern monetary theory, which is a theory which has been developed by a number of leftist economists in the past 10, 15 years or so, is that you don't need austerity. You don't need to balance the books. You can run a deficit finance on your government budgets over a period of time, and by using the spending and borrowing the money in a different way than has been done before, you'll be able to expand the economy, achieve full employment, and you will not have to worry about the debt. So MMT, modern monetary theory, offers a theoretical justification for permanent deficit financing, as Cliff was saying. The state controls the money as the unit of account. The Federal Reserve prints the dollar, so the US Treasury controls the unit of account. So there's no limit on government spending if everybody's prepared to use the dollar, and they are not only nationally but internationally. So governments can just print as many dollars as they like. Of course, we don't mean print in a physical term anymore. We simply mean putting credit into the government accounts or into the commercial banks' accounts. And in this way, governments can spend money and they don't need to worry about that rising public debt. What is that public debt in terms? It's loans issued, loans on the government's accounts. It's also mainly bonds issued by the government, treasury bills, treasury bonds, which the public buys, institutions buy for a certain rate of interest. So MMT is saying you don't need to issue more bonds. You can simply get the Federal Reserve to print the money necessary, and then governments can spend. So the only constraint then becomes whether resources run out, and maybe with capacity in the economy can't be increased anymore, but you're still printing more money, you could create inflation. Then perhaps, say MMT theorists, you can then introduce taxation to, as it were, cool the economy down. So if this is right, then all we need to do is to keep a capitalist economy going is to have more government budget deficits. The only difference between Keynesian deficit financing, for those that don't know, but the Keynesian theory is in crises, when there's a slump, it's best to get demand, aggregate demand up. And if capitalists aren't investing and workers are unemployed and can't spend, the government must intervene by spending more than it can raise in revenue. So it should run a deficit for a period of time. It can pay for that deficit by issuing bonds, as I've said, but once the economy is back in action, then they can bring the budget back into balance and stop borrowing more money. MMT says, no, we want to go further than that, than the Keynesian argument. We disagree that you need to bring these deficits back into line, or that they should be financed by government bonds for banks to buy. Instead, we can do this by the central bank printing money. In a way, the MMT argues theoretically, for those who are interested in economic theory, that actually when banks lend money, or when the Federal Reserve lends money, it actually creates demand by creating deposits. So when you lend money, the person who takes the money puts it in the bank again, so it becomes a deposit. So in a way, they create an increase in spending power in the economy. This is called the endogenous money approach. It's not something where it's necessary to create money from the Federal Reserve. The banks are doing that by issuing loans, and they create extra money in the course of doing that. So money is created by the decisions of entrepreneurs to invest or households to spend, and from the loans that the banks grant them, they create the conditions for an expansion of money, which is issued by the state as a result of that. So at a simple level, modern monetary theory is saying that the way things work in bank money is, that's all we are doing is showing that's how it works. It's like it is. That's the way the monetary system works in a modern economy. And all we're saying that we just have to recognize that and expand that by the issuance of extra state money through the Fed in order to boost an economy. So this theory actually is not consistent, because modern monetary theory says that money is endogenous to the demand being created by households and companies, but actually, historically, they've argued that it's the state that creates money, not households or businesses, in order to spend. It creates the money so that, and it gets that back by the payment of taxes. So in fact, money is created so that people have got money to pay the government taxes. And in this way, we get the circulation of the funds through the monetary system. So the state can force taxes out of citizens and then decide the nature of the legal tender that serves the money. So money is the product of the state, not the process of what is going on in production. Stephanie Kelton, former advisor to Bernie Sanders, wrote a book in the last year called The Deficit Myth, and she's one of the leading exponents of modern monetary theory, and she makes the point it's the state's ability to make and enforce its tax laws that sustains the demand for them, which in turn makes those dollars valuable. So it's not anything to do with what's really going on in the banks or in businesses and households. It's really the creation of money is in the hands of the state. This goes back to a theory called chartalism, developed by a German economist in the 1920s, George Knapp and others. The state has a charter, has the only right to print money, and so it's the state needing to spend and inventing a unit of currency that it can tax people in order to get funds for its own spending. That's the idea of chartalism, from which a lot of modern monetary theory comes from. So when the people get these funds back, they demand the money in order to pay taxes. The money is created by the state and then taken back and destroyed by taxation. So let me just summarize the MMT's idea of how the monetary system works in this modern economy to help us spend more money. It goes, you have state money, which they print, they give it to non-state entities, that's households, corporations, banks, and so on, and then that money is then taxed back, and the state has the money to spend, and it goes round in that circle. So the state injects money into the private sector, that money is reabsorbed with a collection of taxes. So if a government runs a fiscal deficit and spends more than it receives in taxes, the non-state sector ends up with a surplus, which it can use to invest, spend, or employ more, and the state deficit can thus be financed by creating more money. Taxes are not needed to finance state spending, but merely to generate the demand for money to pay taxes. So you see, the state controls the unit of account, the pounds, the dollars, the euros, and therefore it can control the modern economy because it controls the unit of account, and it can spend these units without the constraint of rising debt, namely the rising amount of bonds which governments are supposed to pay. It doesn't need to do that anymore. How does that differ from the Marxist theory of money? Well, it differs in an important way. Marx argues that money emerges naturally from commodity production that is generalized. In other words, money gets used, what is called money, could be a physical commodity which everybody accepts as money, like gold or silver or something like that, or in some sort of money form like paper currency or units of account in banks. And if the state merely validates that money form, it says, yes, it's the money that's being used, the dollar, we recognize that, you can trust it, and we'll produce it accordingly as the demand is there. But the money actually emerges because transactions are going on between businesses, between households, between capitalists and so on. And that's why there's a need for money. Things are not exchanged by barter, they're exchanged by a universal commodity, which everybody recognizes as having a certain value, which they can trust. So, as Marx says, it crystallizes out of the process of exchange in which different products of labor equate with each other and convert it into commodities. So, as people work and they produce commodities, they're sold on the market, this one particular commodity becomes the universal equivalent, the one that we can exchange, we can keep in the bank as store as a value, and so on, to use at a later date. So it doesn't arise by convention, doesn't arise because the state has enforced it, it arises naturally out of the process of exchange. That is Marx's argument, which is differing, as you can see, from the argument presented by the modern monetary theories. So the demand for money is ultimately set really by the pace of accumulation of capital and the capitalist consumption taking place. So workers obviously need money to spend on their goods, but the fundamental driver behind money is the ability, the need for capitalists to expand their production, to accumulate more, and to spend more on their behalf. So that is a different way of looking at how money arises in society. And it also leads me to a key difference between Marxist theory of money and modern monetary theory, because modern monetary theory says if the state has the control of the unit of account, then it has the ability to expand money in an unlimited way. If the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are the only people that can print dollars, then it can expand money indefinitely. Well, it can certainly expand the amount of dollars in the economy, but is it expanding money in the sense of meeting the values in the economy? Now, in Kelton's book, this is a long thing to go through, so I won't do it in the detail it's presented on the screen for you. But she says, look, I went to see Warren Mosler, who is the hedge fund manager in the Virgin Islands, who was the main inspirer of the idea of the modern monetary theory. And Mosler explained to her that, look, this is how it works. I've got my children here and I want them to do chores. So to make them do chores, I say that you're going to tax you. And if you can't pay, then all your privileges will be withdrawn. So he said the tax takes the form of business cards. I've got the business cards. I have to hold the business cards. The children need the business cards in order to avoid losing their privileges. And I will tax them accordingly as long as they try to collect through their chores as many of these cards in order to meet the taxation. So she's saying that it's the pressure of the need for people to be taxed by the state drives them to get demand for money, and that's how the monetary system works. Well, I think that's not really how the monetary system works, because we're talking about a household where there's no exchange going on between the Mosler household and any other household on the Virgin Islands or around the world. There's no trade taking place. It's all locked inside one household where there is no trading going on, but merely a certain amount of labor being done for a certain amount of cards. And that is not the same as the exchange of commodities using a universal equivalent like money. So as Marx says, what you're really doing is like labor chits. I can give you two examples of what that means. That means if you go into the theatre and you put your coat in the cloakroom, you get a ticket for it. And when you go back, you get your coat. Now, what Kelton is telling us is that locker room ticket is actually money. Well, surely it is not. It's a special voucher, which is only available in the theatre and can't be used anywhere else. It's not a universal equivalent. It's specific to that situation. Same applies to what we've had with the airlines cancelling in COVID. A lot of airlines, when you go to cancel your flight, are saying, we're not going to give you your dollars back, which is money. We're going to give you a voucher to buy another flight later on. So you get a voucher. This is not money. This is not a universal representation of the exchange value of all flights. It can't be used anywhere else. So it's only worth the dollar price on that voucher with that airline alone. Inside that airline, these vouchers are money, but nowhere else. That is the important distinction between how Marx would see money and how the modern monetary theorists are doing. They're saying this because the state controls the unit of account, they actually control money. But that's not really theoretically correct, because money only represents value if there's value in the production to back it. Increased government spending from creating more units of account, like dollars, doesn't create value. Indeed, some government spending by the printing of dollars can destroy value, like armaments and so on. Productive value is what gives money credibility as representing value, not the unit of account and the ability of the state to print it. A productive private sector can generate domestic product and income, and then that gives that government currency credibility in the first place. The reason why the dollar is the hard currency of the world, the reserve currency of the world, is the sheer size of the productive capacity of the US economy, its capitalist sector and so on, its trade and its finance sector. Countries with nothing like that strength economically, their currencies are not credible at all. So if Venezuela or Zimbabwe or Turkey print as much money of their own currency as they like in order to expand their economies, what happens is that the value of their currencies relative to the dollar, to the euro and others collapses as a result, because they don't have any credibility in their productive private sectors to achieve that. So you either get massive inflation because the currency is devalued against other currencies, and you get possibly a currency crisis, which has happened. So modern monetary theory, in the sense that it operates the way it is been posed, really would only be relevant to the US or perhaps one or two other very strong economies, not to the vast majority of the world. For me, the problem with MMT is it ignores the crucial factor, the social structure of capitalism. Under capitalism, production and investment is for profit, not for meeting the needs of the people. So profit depends on the ability to exploit the working class sufficiently compared to the cost of investment in technology and productive assets. It does not depend on whether the government has provided enough effective demand. The Keynesians and the MMT people think that what matters in a modern economy is effective demand. Marxist monetary theory says, no, what matters is the profitability of capital for modern economies. That's what's key. And that's why Marxist monetary theory looks at the issue from the point of view of labor, based on the law of value and the exploitation of labor power. MMT has no concept of value or a law of value or the idea of the profitability of capitalist economies, namely that production is for profit, not need. Production is for exchange value, not people's needs and uses. And it's based on the exploitation of production, not on the creation of money for taxation, which is where MMT stops when it looks at an economy. If you look at modern monetary theory in all its exponents, the word profit hardly is mentioned. It does not touch the sides of modern monetary theory that explains what is going on. And what that means is that it misses the point. And I will put it very simply like this aphorism: you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. The bottom line is this: if government can spend these additional funds in a way that makes GDP grow faster than debt, and we know that debt is rising, as we've just seen, politicians don't have to worry about runaway inflation or the piling up of debt. But if this money isn't used productively, then the opposite is true. So if a lot of this money ends up in the stock market or in property markets or in armaments, unproductive spending like that, it can create the conditions by which there's no growth in capacity and there's a huge expansion of money. This is going to pose a question either in a complete explosion of the financial assets market, which is what we've seen as a result of the injections of money by the Fed, or even a rise in inflation in goods. As Michael Pettis, who's a leading Keynesian economist, not a Marxist, said, creating or borrowing money does not increase a country's wealth unless doing so results directly or indirectly in an increase in productive investment. If US companies are reluctant to invest, not because the cost of capital is high, but rather because the expected profitability is low, they are unlikely to respond by investing more. And MMT can't overcome that obstacle of what is the profitability for the capitalist sector in any economy, particularly the US one. Doesn't matter how much cash is shoved into their faces, if they don't want, they won't want to spend because the profitability of investment is not there for the capitalists. So the key policy that MMT puts forward, and this is where we get back to policies now, is that it says that if we spend money, don't worry about the debt, to the point where we can achieve full employment. Many MMT people call for a government job guarantee, which sounds good. Why shouldn't we guarantee a job for everybody? And that job can be guaranteed if they want or need it. The government will employ them on projects or pay them to get a job. And we can print the money to achieve that. Most people work for capitalist companies or the government, but unemployment remains here, and there's a sizable section of the workforce now under COVID that are going to be unemployed. Something like 21 million haven't got a job at the moment in the US. So the government needs to step in as an employer of last resort. Biden is not advocating this, but this is the main policy conclusion that comes from modern monetary theory. One of the leading exponents of modern monetary theory, Bill Mitchell, an Australian economist, said what the government should be doing is building up a buffer stock of jobs to absorb workers who can't find employment in the private sector. So by spending money, we can pick up these people, absorb them into government jobs, and then as workers are displaced to the private sector, and this buffer stock employees will be paid this $15 an hour minimum wage, which defines the wage floor for the bottom. So basically, the conclusion here is not hiring at the top, but hiring at the bottom. So if you're right at the bottom of the job scale and you're about to be made unemployed, the government will pick you up and give you a minimum wage, as long as it's not in competition with the market sector wage structure. I'm going to emphasize this that MMT exponents are saying, yes, they want full employment and they want it at minimum wages, but they don't want to pay workers' wages, which should actually threaten and compete with the capitalist companies who are currently employing people at perhaps a little bit more. By not competing with the private market, and this is in quotes from Mitchell, the job guarantee would avoid the inflationary tendencies of old-fashioned Keynesianism, which attempted to maintain full capacity employment by hiring off the top. So I see this as really hiring off the bottom is like a backstop to capitalism. Capitalism is fading, workers are losing their jobs. The answer is to pick up those who are unemployed at a minimum wage level until they can get back into the private sector. It doesn't seem to me a very radical program in changing the structure of the economy and really establishing permanent full employment, not just permanent deficits, but permanent full employment at reasonable wages, meeting the needs of people. Just here's an empirical graph. The argument of most Keynesians and MMT people is if you spend more money, you lower unemployment rates through the boosting of aggregate demand and growth. Well, you can run a correlation against the unemployment rates. This is the unemployment rate in various countries in the OECD. On the vertical line, that's the unemployment rate. So the going up is a higher unemployment rate, more spending this way as a percentage of GDP, 50, 55%, 60% of GDP. Now, if you spend more of GDP, then you should have a lower unemployment rate. So instead of this line going in this direction, it should be going from where unemployment rate is written there, down towards here. It should be going from the top left to the bottom right. But in fact, there's a trend showing a correlation with higher government spending correlating with higher unemployment. So this seems to be in contradiction with the Keynesian MMT theory. And why is that? I think if you think about it, the answer is this, that when capitalism goes down, when production is reduced, investment drops, and people are made unemployed, unemployment rises, this forces governments, either through the automatic stabilizers of extra unemployment benefits and so on, and loss of tax revenues, to spend more, it comes automatically, or they introduce fiscal stimulus programs like Biden is doing now. So what happens is, this is the causal factor. Rising unemployment causes higher government spending, not the other way around, because what is more important in a modern capitalist economy is what is going on for the profitability of capitalism in the capitalist sector, not the aggregate demand as such. And I think this diagram gives you some proof towards that argument against MMT. So let me summarize, Cliff and everybody. MMT is rather a modern monetary theory, but in my view is more a magic money tree. What we're saying here is that MMT boys and girls say that if the government keeps on spending, it would lead to households spending more, and the capitalists will invest more, thus full employment can be restored without any change in the social structure of the economy. Nothing is changing. All we're doing is the state is printing money. It's got control of the unit of account. We run deficits indefinitely until there is full employment. We don't have to do anything else in this modern capitalist economy. But so under the MMT, all the private banks, the Goldman Sachses, the Morgan Stanleys, the Citibanks, they remain untouched. Big pharmaceutical companies who've so abysmally failed to provide us vaccines until recently, they'll remain in place, screwing us for their drugs. Nothing is MMT is suggesting, we have nothing to say about that. Fossil fuel companies would still be here. No change from MMT. All the big companies like the FANGs would remain untouched. So there would nothing really changing in the social structure of capitalism. The stock market would roll on at an expanding pace as money pours into it. So in that sense, can capitalism really be fixed with the help of the state, financed by the MMT policy? Because if capitalism is continually going into crisis, and that's the argument of Marxist value theory, that it gets into a profitability crisis, which causes regular and recurring slumps every 8 to 10 years or so of varying degrees of depth and extension, as in the Great Recession of 2008-9, and we see the slump now caused by COVID, but so difficult for for it to get out of. What is MMT saying about this, or Keynesian policy in general? Nothing about the regular recurring process of crisis. All it's saying is if there's a slack in the demand, there's too many people unemployed, just spend print money and we'll go to full employment and it will be solved. So for them, government spending can be expanded to any level necessary to achieve full employment through money issuance without any reference to the productive activity of what's going on outside the state, in particular the profitability of the capitalist sector. MMT reckons that capitalism can be saved, really, by harmonious and achieve harmonious growth and full employment with what Marx used to call tricks of circulation. It was all due to money, and there's nothing else in the social structure of the economic system that was relevant. But it does ignore or hides the social relations of the exploitation of labor for profit and the contradictions that exist under a capitalist economy between profit, growth, and employment. So you could say, despite the very good intentions of the exponents of modern monetary theory who aim to improve the conditions of labor, to end unemployment, to avoid the ridiculously nasty and callous policies of austerity based on the neoclassical ideas of the mainstream and of right-wing governments, as it opposes that, it doesn't offer us a way, a fundamental way out of the crises which keep recurring. And in that sense, it's a bit of snake oil. It's something that's saying that we can change society we can improve conditions very easily and permanently we can improve them by the use of the printing of money and the expansion of deficits on a permanent basis, funded not by bonds, not by more debt, but by simply expanding the unit of account. It seems to me a way short of what is really needed to permanently change society for the better of the majority of people in the US and elsewhere. That's me.
Okay, Michael, thank you for a very provocative presentation, a very dense presentation for many, I'm sure. But now we come to your opportunity to raise questions or make comments. To do that, those of you who are watching on YouTube should send your questions or comments to this email address, global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. And I will be monitoring that and then pass the questions on to our speaker. If you are in the Zoom room, as some of you are, you can ask your questions directly. And to do that, what you need to do is turn on your video and wave at me. And when I see you waving, I'll call on you and you can unmute your mic and present your question directly to Michael Roberts. So I'm looking to see if anyone here in the Zoom room is ready with a question or a comment. We can have dialogue here. It's one of the advantages of the Zoom room. Who wants to go first? Okay, I see Lauren. Unmute yourself, Lauren.
No, I was just changing my camera.
Oh.
As you say, Cliff, it was probably a bit too quick and dense. So if people want to ask me questions about bits they don't understand, please do.
Yeah, in fact, I was wondering, would you be willing to share your PowerPoint for those who are interested? Yeah. They could, if you sent it to me, I could then send it on to those who.
Of course, I'll do that. In fact, I might try and post it on chat.
Mm-hmm.
So you didn't record this, right?
Oh, yes, this has been recorded and will be
Good,
available.
I'd like to get it, I would like to get a copy. For me, I'm with a group called Strike Debt, and we read how to maybe move the system along.
Yeah.
And so we've read the Kelton together, and
Ah,
I've been charmed by it. Oh, we can give everybody plenty of money, and that would not affect the downfall of the United States or any system. So that's been good for me. All the things you said talking about it, I have to go over slowly.
yeah.
This rate at which you said everything was I need to slow it down and collect each kind of sentence
Yeah.
or paragraph. And I'm familiar, as I say, with a lot of it, and I think that your presentation was, as it was said, was dense, but that was really good. It was really good. I'm looking forward to reviewing it and making substantial my understanding. Being able to explain it better than I have been able to explain it as that fairy kind of financing or magical kind of financing that you were talking about.
Well, I'll post it to Cliff, but I'll also post it on my Facebook site so all the YouTube viewers can go there and get it as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yes, this is being recorded and will be available, as are all of our webinars, on our website, globaljusticecenter.org.
Right.
So that should be up, for viewing by tomorrow, I think.
The trouble is right now, Michael answered all the questions. There's just a whole lot of stuff.
Oh, I doubt that.
Well, what would you expect people still have questions about? I mean, you said.
I would expect people to disagree with me and say it's not right that modern monetary theory is the way I described it. When I have debated with many modern monetary theorists, there are two lines of argument. One, you've completely misunderstood what MMT is, although I struggle to work out exactly what I've misunderstood, but that's my view. And the second one is that it's not true that we haven't noticed about the social structure of the private sector and society. Many of us are socialists, MMT people would say, and we are in favor of getting the pharmaceutical companies under control, getting the fossil fuel companies under control. But they say that's not relevant to MMT. All we're doing with MMT is showing that the government can spend as much as it likes. I'm saying, well, that opens up a misleading view about what we can do.
Okay.
I do have a question now.
Okay, go ahead, Lawrence.
Okay, my question, recently, Robert Reich, who is still, is about as good as you're going to get for liberals, and he's still a Keynesian, but he basically posted something, I think it was in The Guardian, if I'm not mistaken, but perhaps I am, that unless the Biden administration moves to the left, it's going to basically create the conditions for another Trump. Now, given what you were saying about the influence of MMT in the Biden administration, I mean, as a socialist, I have very little faith. The only thing I can say good about the Biden administration, well, no, there's exceptions in some places, but in terms of economics, defense, and state, I'm not very happy. If you're right, then nothing is good. Then basically in 2024, we're going to see a more intelligent version of Trump.
Well,
not as harsh.
I think that there's going to be an attempt to, well, we've seen the huge fiscal package. It's quite large. It's the largest fiscal package that any administration since the New Deal under Roosevelt has introduced. So that is significant in one way, but then the crisis is so severe that any administration's got to consider doing something about this unless they wish to see another year of slump ahead, with many businesses going bust, the unemployment rates continuing to stay at a ludicrously high level, because at the moment it looks very low, but that's a fake figure. If we include all the people on programs and so on, we're talking about 25 million Americans out of work at the moment, adult Americans out of work who had jobs before. So this is a huge problem. So the fiscal spending is necessary. The argument, I think, is twofold about the Biden administration. Firstly, is this going to be implemented in full? Secondly, it's spread out of quite a long period of time. When we talk about the $15 an hour minimum wage, that's not coming in on January the 20th in 2 days' time. That's going to be spread out sometime in the future. The infrastructure spending is over 4 years. When you break it down per year, it's not such a big figure as an increase in the expending for government investment. In the US and in other modern advanced economies, government investment as a percentage of GDP on average is about 3% of GDP, just 3% of GDP. Capitalist investment as a percentage of GDP in most economies is anything between 15 and 25% of GDP. So it's the capitalist sector that decides the future of an economy at the moment, whether those big multinationals and the smaller companies are prepared to invest. And it's not decided by government investment. Even the Biden program, if fully implemented, would raise the percentage of GDP from public investment from, say, 3% to 4%. That's quite a sizable jump from where we've seen before, but it's not going to change the ultimate investment decision and the process of production in US economy, because it's up to the 20% or 25% that the big companies and the small companies are spending. And profitability of capital, excluding the FANGs and the figures we see for Amazon or Facebook or Goldman Sachs, the swathe of companies across the US are making the lowest profits they've made in profitability terms that they've made for 20 or 30 years. They're in no position. There's a huge number of zombie companies, we call them, who are just making enough profits to pay their debts. They're servicing their debts, but they can't expand, they can't invest. They've just got their heads above water and the water's gurgling towards their mouths. So there's a load of companies on the edge, and that's not going to be transformed by a bit of government investment. It requires a radical structure. So not so much to the extent that we'll end up with Biden turning into Trump, but it's not going to quieten down the reaction of populism or right-wing populism if in 2 or 3 years' time we don't have full employment, we don't have an expansion of the economy so people can feel they're getting good, proper jobs. We're really much where we were in 2019, and that seems quite likely, because in 2019, people forget, things were not great in the US or in Europe or in Japan. We'd already seen a significant slowdown in industry and so on. It was a situation where the inequalities have risen to a significant level, both in income and wealth. This last year, the COVID has been a huge rise in inequality, as the rich, the top 0.1% are making huge money on the stock market and so on, and the profit, while the swathe of the population in ordinary jobs are struggling to make ends meet. So can Biden transform that picture in the next 2 or 3 years with the program he's offering now? I don't think so. It requires a much more radical program than this. And getting back to the subject of tonight, MMT doesn't take us on that issue. It says, oh yes, well the Biden can do this and he can spend it without issuing more debt. Well, okay, he can, and he can for a while, and the debt will not come back to hit him for a while, particularly while interest rates are low, but it's not going to transform the economy sufficiently to make it a bright future for the majority of Americans. And the polarization of America will not disappear as a result, and could intensify as we get towards the end of this administration over the next 4 years. Finally, I know it's a bit long answer, but just remember, capitalism doesn't move gradually upwards. It moves up and then it has big slumps. And every 8 or 10 years, you can have a big slump. There's no guarantee that even under the next 4 years, that Biden will have a smooth path if capitalism enters some sort of crisis of production and investment, particularly if there's some sort of credit crunch with loads of smaller and medium-sized firms going bust, which will leave a whole swathe of American service industries in particular in a disastrous position. So if we have a policy simply that you spend money and run deficit, where however you pay for it by printing money or issuing bonds, as your only policy for ensuring full employment, better standards of living, environmental improvements, dealing with climate change. Is this enough? It's way short of even what was in the New Deal.
Yeah,
we have other questions coming.
Sorry about that long one.
Let me put this screen up again for people who are on YouTube, so that you can get your questions in. It's global.justice.cliff@gmail.com. Okay, Lauren, you had a follow-up, and then we'll go to
more
Betsy
of a
Bowman.
comment and a follow-up. Yeah, taking off on what you said, which you put much more elegantly than I could economically. But one of the trends that we've seen even before the COVID hit is that a lot of retailers are going out of business. And we're not talking about the mom and pop stores. I know that, contrary to my typical Marxism, I tend to be a foodie. And one of the things I've noticed is that about 30% or so of our restaurants are not going to reopen. They're just not going to make it. Okay. And then when this morning, there was a thing I watched for about a minute or two on my computer about a number of very large national chains that are also going under, whether it's especially like retailing and food service. And part of this, and this began, I think, parenthetically from what you were saying, that more and more people are both buying stuff online, which is part of the reason that Bezos made $15 billion in one day. And a lot more people, especially those of us that are isolated and homebound, are doing cooking. And that basically means not going to restaurants or ordering from restaurants and things like that. So Nouriel Roubini, and I'm sure you know his work, don't you? Yeah, he basically said that this slump is going to last for several years. And for people like myself, that I'm not an economic determinist, that this does not bode well for progressive movement. It basically suggests that the right wing, at least in the United States, and I don't know enough about the British case, but the right wing is not going to go away with Trump disappearing. And that one of my colleagues basically suggested that Kristi Noem, she's the governor of North Dakota. She's very, very smart and very personable, but she may wind up the leader. I'm not an astrologer to make predictions, but what is scary is that someone who is not as irrational and narcissistic and crazy as psychopathic as Trump could very well take advantage of it. And you didn't say this, these weren't your words, but if we continue the policies that Biden is likely to continue, we are in, as economists like myself, I'm not an economist, I'm a sociologist, would say, we're in deep shit, because it's not going to solve the fundamental problems. And if it doesn't, there are all of those people waiting in the sidelines to lead the Fourth Reich.
Okay, Michael.
No, I think you'll have to take some more questions. So I think Lawrence.
Okay.
I can't really disagree with anything he said.
All right, let's give the mic to Betsy Bowman, who has been following your blog.
Hi, I'm Betsy Bowman. I'm with the Center for Global Justice, which is what my name appears to be. I was very interested in hearing your emphasis on in Marxist theory on the basis that value is based in exploitation, that profit is based in the exploitation of labor. And this is something that modern monetary theory doesn't touch at all. And I've always wondered, why is it that people are so reluctant to concede that they have a job because the owner of the business is making money off of their labor? It's dumbfounding that people don't realize that they're producing more value than they're receiving, and that's why they're getting paid. Another phrase that I might use for modern monetary theory, I think Ellen Brown relies upon modern monetary theory to back her work up, is not a magic money tree, but too good to be true. And of course, we all know anything that's too good to be true is probably too good to be true. But we're clearly, obviously, the economic crisis started before COVID.
Yeah.
It wasn't the pandemic that started the economic crisis. The crisis among the debt levels of businesses, households, students is astronomical. And of course, the pandemic has exacerbated this through unemployment and so forth. But you know, I always go back to Rosa Luxemburg, Socialism or Barbarism. How are we going to be able to convince people not only that they're voting against their own interests, but that that the system has to be fundamentally changed so that production is not for profit, but is rather for need? And how can we convince people that you like democracy? Okay, how about democracy at the workplace?
Yeah.
How about self-management? Obviously, Rick Wolf is talking about this all the time. Many economists are. I also think of David Graeber, who talked about how most people think their jobs are just shit. Yeah. And they are. How do we explain to people that, if we don't have a reasonable, peaceful, pacific change to an economy based on need, including the needs of the planet and the animals and the climate, we're going to, the Roman Empire fell and there was 100 years of chaos. Yeah. And things were dreadful. And then they had the Dark Ages for 800 years. And we have to remember that the people who opened the gates of the city of Rome to the so-called barbarians were the middle classes and the upper middle classes, because it was the only way they could get rid of their leaders. So there's not really a particular question there, but the direness of the situation is so great. How can we go about reaching those on the right who, for the most part, are in desperate straits themselves? And what advice do you have for this, Michael?
Well,
Robert?
If I knew the answer to your question, Betsy, and we all knew the answer, we would know exactly what to do, and we'd have changed the world by now. It's a continual struggle to explain clearly what is wrong with the way in which we organize our society now in capitalism. When I say we, obviously the majority of people don't have a say in this, in the organization of our society. And as you say, when people go to work, do they realize that they go to work and get supposedly a fair wage for a fair day's work, supposedly? But of course, this isn't true, in the sense that they obviously produce more value in the products and services that they produce for the owners of the plant, of the office, the factory, whatever it is, the intellectual rights and so on. That these owners of capital are the ones that are able to gain unpaid labor out of the labor force and sell that into the market and make surplus value, as Marx called it, or we might just call it profit. So that's how profit comes about. The reason that modern monetary theory and Keynesianism doesn't look at profit is because they deny this process. They don't want to know about that particular process of exploitation. For them, what's wrong with capitalist economy is that there's not enough demand. If capitalists aren't investing enough, they're saving too much, or workers aren't spending enough and they're saving too much. What we need is to get people to spend more, and if they won't, if the governments can spend, then everything will flow smoothly. So the market economy doesn't need to be changed. The process of exploitation doesn't need to be changed. It's just sometimes it seems to get stuck. I think that the leading Keynesian, Paul Krugman, once called it capitalist crisis a technical malfunction. It just so happens a bit of a technical problem. We just have to sort it out by greasing the wheels of industry with a bit of money, and then off it goes again. Well, I think the reply to that is yes, it goes off again and then it comes down again. And so we go through series of booms and slumps, and each one actually seems to be getting worse in this 21st century than the previous one. And we have to really worry about where we're going. Now, maybe we haven't reached the point of socialism and barbarism yet, as Rosa pointed out in 1918, or whether she wrote The Accumulation of Capital, but that is the process that you head towards. That is, soon there will be no alternative over maybe the next decade or two, I don't know, perhaps not in my lifetime. Will be no alternative but to operate for a complete change in the system, or we head backwards, as you say, towards what happened to the Roman Empire after that, and the collapse of what we call civilization. That is only likely to happen if we get reactionary leaders who come to power and operate in that direction. But the danger is there. There's no doubt that the class struggle is taking a more intense form in that sense, that the choice between the center is no longer with us. The harmonious, gradual process of moving forward, like we got after the Second World War, of gradual improvement in employment and so on, and a welfare state and better wages, that's gone, hasn't it? It's now a real struggle for the mass of people on the one hand, and for governments to sustain the economy on the other hand. And they don't have the policies or the approach to deal with that. So we have real danger over the next 10 years. I don't know how it's going to develop. Can we convince people to recognize this danger coming up? Not only that they're being exploited, but also the dangers that lie ahead? I don't know, but we have to do the best we can. This is what meetings like this are. I know maybe these meetings are between us who all more or less agree on this approach, but by increasing our own understanding, perhaps we can go out and explain to others in the course of when movements arise, and they will arise. Workers don't stand around. Americans and Brits and European working people don't stand around forever doing nothing. They do go into struggle on various occasions, and then we have the opportunity to perhaps explain how that should, how we see it developing, and what we need to do about it.
Thank you.
We do have a question that has come in here from Thomas Lambert. He says, I heard Michael speak in Lille, France in 2019. Excellent talk then and today. Enjoyed it. Pardon if this is a bad question. I arrived late. Don't the MMT people admit that their plan eventually will trigger inflation after an upper limit is reached?
Yeah, that's their position, because when they're attacked by the right-wing mainstream economists for saying that if you keep running deficits, or print money, you're going to cause inflation, they reply, well, you only get inflation when you run out of capacity. So in other words, when there's full employment, when all the factories are full capacity, offices are full, maximum action is taking place on production, then if you keep printing money, you will cause inflation, which is obviously correct. So their argument is, when we see that's about to happen, then we stop printing money. In fact, we start taxing the economy and reduce the deficits. That's when we reduce the deficits. So that way we can try and keep full employment balanced on the eye of the needle between going down to unemployment or having inflation, and we can just manage the economy between taxing and printing money so that there's full employment without inflation. It's a classic Keynesian position, which goes back to the period after the Second World War, where we were told that we just need to balance between the possibility of inflation and higher unemployment, And the job of governments is to get the budget deficit dead right and the plenty of money dead right, so that we don't have either. We have full employment without inflation. Well, the history of the last 60 years has shown that's not been possible. You either end up with both, which is what we got in the 1970s, stagflation, unemployment and inflation, or you end up with big slumps and then inflation. What we've seen in the last 30 years, however, inflation has gone right down. It's gone really low. And we've had, particularly since the Great Recession, surprisingly, in certain countries, almost quite a low level of unemployment. But we know why this is the case, is that the jobs that people are getting now are low wage, precarious jobs, temporary, part-time, contract work, not proper jobs with skills and careers behind them, but a whole range of really what I think mentioned David Graeber, bullshit jobs, which don't really provide a future for the families and so on. And they're low wage jobs, therefore the inflation isn't strong, being driven by wages, and on the other hand, interest rates are low, so there's not a boost in inflation either. So the question of inflation immediately is not an issue, but yes, there is a constraint. MMT people admit there is a constraint on their budget deficit policy, namely a return of inflation, but they believe they can balance this between inflation and unemployment. I don't think the history of capitalist and Keynesian policy has shown that to be correct. It will fall.
Can we shift the focus for a moment to some of the poorer countries of the world, countries of Africa or Latin America, who under COVID have, economies that are collapsing, that don't have, at least I don't think, have the option of simply printing money to get the economy going again. They're also in very heavy debt internationally. Take a country like Costa Rica, which has been one of the more prosperous countries in Latin America. They now have a huge debt crisis, have been begging the IMF for loans, and as a result, popular demonstrations against IMF packages. Do they have any option under modern monetary theory, or even under Keynesianism?
Well, I don't think so. No doubt MMT proponents will disagree with me and say, yes, that their policy applies to the global South economies and governments as well. But I can't see how that it does, because if it depends on trust in the currency and the value of the purchasing power of that currency in national governments, then clearly that is not going to be the case. Because as you say, that these governments have been running up huge debts, and they're not just debts, domestic debts to the people within the country, but they're also foreign debts, huge foreign debts. US debt is high, public debt is high, and corporate debt is high, but most of it is domestic. It's quite a sizable portion of foreign debt, but it's still relatively small. But in the case like Costa Rica or Argentina or Mexico, the level of foreign denominated debt in dollars, euros, and so on is really high as part of the public sector debt. So if you start printing loads of Mexican pesos, you're going to be in trouble with the currency that Mexico's got against other currencies, because foreigners will start to withdraw their money because they fear that this will not be worth anything. And that because a large sizable part of the debt is in their hands, this can cause a serious debt crisis. The answer, Mexico is a very good example of an economy that was going downhill before the COVID started. It was already in a slump, and that the COVID has made that worse. It's not had the health resources, the financing that will enable it to deal with the COVID on a health aspect. People are mainly in informal economies there, so they have to go to work. They can't work from home and expect to be paid by their employer, and certainly not by government. So they're in a seriously difficult position, and yet they're building up these debts. The answer for the global South and its debts is not modern monetary theory. It's a decision to cancel the debts of all the global South companies. It's not a huge amount of money. It is for them, but compared to the rich position of the advanced capitalist economies, it will be easy to cancel these debts, to write them off, But of course, that would mean bondholders in US, Wall Street, in the City of London would lose a lot of money. They'd either have to be bailed out by governments at home, or they would have to take the hit if this was, or if all these debts were cancelled. So far, all the IMF has done is said, no, we're not going to cancel debts. We're just not going, you don't have to pay the interest on the debts you owe us for a few years, but the debt remains. That's what they call debt relief. It's interest rate relief for a few years. When they discussed reducing the debt a bit, all the private creditors, that's the bondholders, the hedge funds, the vulture funds, the big banks, refused to cancel the debt to the global south economies in any way or reduce it in any way. And that's the situation as we go into 2021. Modern monetary theory, printing more money, more pesos, Argentine, Mexican, whatever, Turkish lira, doesn't seem to me to offer any solution for governments in that situation.
Now, canceling the debt was exactly the prescription that Cuba recommended when Latin America had its debt crisis in the 1980s.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they did not take that advice.
No. If you remember, everybody, that what happened in the 1990s with the Latin American debt was that a US Treasury Secretary called Brady said, I'll tell you what, we won't cancel the debt, but we'll convert it, all the debt you've got, into what we'll call Brady bonds, so that you restructure the debt. So now you owe the US government Brady bond debt, which is at a lower rate of interest, and it's not quite so severe. But so in a way, they restructured the debt briefly and basically put most of Latin America in hock to the US government. Actually, the Brady bond debt is still being paid off. Here we are 40 years later.
One exception in the global south that should be mentioned, if you consider China in the global south, is China, with its public bank, has been able to finance immense infrastructure development, whether it's profitable in the short run or not, but it keeps the economy going. In fact, I saw the other day that IMF has projected that this year, of all of global economic growth, 60% of it will be in China.
Yeah. And we just had today the announcement from the Chinese that in the fourth quarter of 2020, they grew by 6.5% the GDP. And so over the whole year of 2020, the Chinese economy has grown by 2.3%. It's the only economy in the world, or the only large one, but actually probably the only economy in the world in 2020 that did not have a slump in production, but actually grew. Not very much, but it grew. It's been able to come out of the COVID slump in the first half of 2020 to grow in the second half of 2020. The US, Europe, Japan, all the other countries are nowhere. Throughout 2021, they'll be struggling to get back to where they were at the beginning of 2019. China's achieved that for one of the reasons you said, because it has a state-directed, state-controlled economy on the whole, it's able to plow money into these areas at a much higher level, a much more effective way than even Biden's fiscal stimulus program will do. And yet also, they've been able to control and suppress the virus through very drastic policies of state intervention, test and trace, and so on, which the population has gone along with on the whole. So by controlling the virus, they've been able to restore growth, and they've been able to expand it through a fiscal stimulus program or state investment through the banks, which no other country has been able to do.
We have another question here from another economist with us, David Barkin.
David, yeah.
Unmute yourself.
Hello, Michael Roberts.
Hi, David.
I have two comments to make. One, the Argentine situation allows us to understand much more clearly the nature of debt. Because during the Macri regime, but even during the Macri regime, they were able to get a forgiveness of IMF rules. And the IMF financed what in any other situation shouldn't have been financed. And the Macri regime, of course, started to repay all the vulture bondholders from Wall Street.
Yeah.
So I would like to introduce a concept which you haven't done today. And I'm surprised, knowing your background. And that is that the IMF is really heightening the role of the class struggle on an international basis. I presume that you don't have any problem with that. But the Argentine situation shows it in a particularly bloody way. What Macri did with the IMF and the U.S. Treasury was tie the hands of the next government by changing the what is it called? The profile of debt. What is that called? The debt redemption profile.
Yeah.
And so what it did was basically force the current Fernandez regime into a situation where it's going to have to, it has no choice. It's going to have to, one way or another, renounce very, very substantial amounts of its debt because there's no way that it can be paid off. But that seems to me to be an important part of this discussion. We have to understand that the operation of the monetary system is just another tool in the global class struggle. And while the Argentine situation makes it particularly evident, here in Mexico, which is where I'm talking from, the situation is not very, very different. 30% of the budget in our country goes to debt payment for the privatization of the banks, which was then assumed as a public debt. And it's just rather extraordinary that the president, López Obrador, wrote a book describing this extraordinary theft by the international the international private banking system by getting the Mexican government to assume all of the obligations of the private banks which went bankrupt during the mid-1990s. And as a result, of course, of years of bad policies by the Salinas de Gortari government. But I won't go into that. But the fact is that today, the only real option the Mexican government would have to free its hands from what is the current situation, the budgetary situation in this country, would be to renounce the debt. And that's not a political possibility, but it shows the role of money in a global class struggle. And I would urge you in future presentations, I think your presentation today was very, very clear, but there's this one little element that you left out of it, and that's the global class struggle.
Yes, you're right, David. I did leave out the global issues. I suppose they're concentrated on the US because that's where MMT has its strongest base, and where we've just had Stephanie Kelton's book, and we now have the Biden program. So the idea that MMT is actually on board with the administration has been something that's raised. But of course, you're absolutely right that this is the international money printing, or if you're more likely, credit situation, is a weapon used by imperialism, really. I mean, the International Monetary Fund is not an organization that's just benefiting the global south with its help and so on. It's designed in order to make sure that the imperialist capitalist system works effectively and the countries run by small countries with capitalists running them with their governments, hopefully, operate in harmony with the major economies of the global north. And the countries that step out of line will get hammered. And those countries that are prepared to impose the requirements of their own capitalist class and imperialism will be helped. In the case of Argentina, as you know, the Macri government, which was a right-wing government, was given, I think, $57 billion by the IMF to bail it out and to pay off its creditors at the time. That was breaking all the IMF rules to do that.
Right.
And they wanted to do that because they wanted politically to preserve the Macri government. It didn't survive because the economy went down the chute anyway, and then we had COVID, leaving the centre-left government of the Pluralists and Kirchner in a difficult position. They appointed a new Treasury Department head from the left wing, a heterodox economist who negotiated a deal with the creditors on the debt that was still left, and enabled temporarily for Argentina to avoid defaulting. But you're right, David, there is no way Argentina is going to avoid defaulting on its debt. That deal was a really bad one for the Argentine people and the government, but it was forced on the Argentine government. But eventually a point's going to be reached on the default. They've defaulted before, so there's every possibility they will default again. And it won't be just Argentina. Already we've seen some small countries like Zambia who have had to default on the debts that they've got as a result of the COVID pandemic. So this is going to be a major thing during 2021, not just defaults of companies in the US and the service sectors and elsewhere, but also internationally through global South governments in really difficult positions, unable to meet their debt obligations, and with no effort being made internationally to relieve them of those debts in any form, either by the private creditors or by the IMF and the state creditors behind them.
Well, I would add, I mean, you have the unrest right now in the election in Uganda, which basically can be traced to that. But even more incredibly, from my perspective and from the perspective of Cliff's previous question about the poor countries in Africa, the IMF has a tool that it could have used to facilitate, for example, healthcare and the vaccine financing all over the world, and that's called SDRs, the special drawing rights. And that's a different form of printing money.
It is, yeah.
And the nice thing about the SDRs, if they'd been used, is that they don't really create an obligation, a taxing obligation or something. It's just injecting purchasing power into the countries, into the very highly developed, highly indebted countries of the third world that could have used it for the vaccine financing and the health care financing. And so right now what you have is this stupid kind of situation where the World Health Organization is having to put out its hat to get contributions rather than the IMF using these SDRs to really just solve the problem.
Yeah, of course, the IMF is controlled by the major imperialist powers. They didn't want to increase the credit power of the IMF through the SDRs. The idea was to double the amount of SDRs. I think it was 1 trillion to 2 trillion. That 1 trillion could have been spent, as you say, in all these areas to help governments in the global South. No, they would rather screw these governments than hand that sort of bailout money to them. Meanwhile, of course, governments at home are handing out bail money by the droves to big business to keep them going.
But I would correct something you just said.
Yeah.
IMF isn't controlled by the big government powers, it's controlled by the big banking powers.
Well, yeah.
I think that it's wrong to understand the IMF as an organization of governments rather than an organization of the international banking, capitalist banking community. And And I think that in that situation, it makes it even more clear, the IMF situation, in heightening the world class struggle, the global class struggle, in which, yes, countries are being messed over. I have a different word in my mind, but I'll use messed over. And and what's behind Cliff's observation,
Yeah.
very, very important. We have to understand there was an alternative, and the international community abdicated.
Yep. Can't disagree, David. No.
I think we have time for one more question.
I'd
And
like to,
Norma
I'd like
Harrison
to make a comment. Yeah,
has,
thank you.
has been waving her hand. So, okay, you get the last question.
Yeah, well, it's not so much a question. Well, anyway, the person who spoke in the purple flower dress, I don't know her name because it's called the Center for Justice or
That's
something.
Betsy.
Okay. So I had several responses as you were speaking, and the top one is, why do you think the U.S. government, Jerko, declared Cuba an enemy, a terrorist state? And we all know that they do it because they're so scared of Cuba. You get that? So that's our organizing. That's the organizing we need to perpetuate. And I ask you what you have been doing the past 10, 20, 30, 50 years. And I say it's been organizing to overcome this situation by many means. You talk about healthcare to serve the people. That's the direct opposite of what healthcare structure is here now.
Mm.
And so that's one way to work on the problem. Another is to remember that capitalists are not going to be converted. We do not have to speak to the right, the people who own us. They're quite satisfied they own us and they get huge amounts of benefits on a regular basis from that ownership. How do they do it? Because they own the jobs. Not that jobs is a wonderful structure. Jobs is a clear relation, as I've written, of labor to capital. And that's our job. Our job is to get into the constant lexicon, the constant conversation. Do you know that I am being fucked over every day because I am forced to go work for this measly return of money and hugely benefit a person or an entity that owns my job? If we can get this to be a mantra, labor is the relationship of us to capital. That can be an easily understood kind of, a preachment, the same way people say, oh, God will do this and God will do that. So just to change the discussion, help people change the discussion at its base, and also not to think about proper jobs. I would like you to describe for me a proper job, because I say none of them is. I've been I run for office in Berkeley for the school board, because school is a terrible thing that we impose on ourselves. It's been painful to everybody. Everybody hates school. We have a lot of selective amnesia that lets us say, oh no, my school was great and this and that. It was painful, and if you had good experiences, I'm not saying you didn't. I'm saying that for the standard, like a job, school is not a learn living in the world and working together. without age segregation. Not if somebody, if the adult has to go off to a job that'll make profit for our owners. So that's the objective, is to change that relationship and to get people to see it. They don't, they listen to my speech, my platform, and they say, well, we have to send it, we have to send the children for daycare. And that's what people have to recognize. We're paying a certain amount for people to babysit our children instead of allowing our children to participate as intelligently as they are and their intelligence. And we don't access that resource. We deny it. We dehumanize. We make people feel bad because we take away from them their substance by saying, no, you have to sit here in the third grade and do this lesson that's boring for you. And that's the way school is, even at the university level. It's still going into positions that serve the setup, the system. So to the degree that we can recognize that ourselves and convey it in any way, or actually support people who already think it but don't have a way to say it. People already think the things I'm talking about, but there's no forum for it. You can go to church and see all your friends and tell about God, but you cannot go except to our meetings. And then we don't do it very well in our meetings. You cannot go to our meetings and say, the job sucks and I don't like it and it's oppressive to me. And then I have to convey it to my child and make them get up in the break of dawn when they're having all that good sleep and send them off to school so I can go work for the owners and make profit for them.
Okay, Norma, in the moments remaining, does anyone wish to reply to any of that? We really have gone over time, so. Well, let me thank Michael Roberts for your presentation and remind people that if you want a copy of his PowerPoint, send me an email and I'll pass it on to you. We really appreciate your opening up this discussion for us today, Michael. It was very provocative and very deep, and I'm sure that many of our viewers will want to view the recording of the webinar and deepen their understanding of the issues that are involved here. And I want to thank all of our audience for your participation. Today's program, as well as all of our past webinars, are available on our website at globaljusticecenter.org. Let me just call your attention to our next webinar, which will be, not that one, excuse me. I just want to screen share the announcement of the next webinar, which will be a tribute to Leo Penich, who died just last month, unexpectedly. He had done a webinar for us earlier on capitalism, socialism, and the pandemic. And we will replay his talk next Monday, but also have two of his colleagues with us to talk about Leo, Greg Albo and I forget who the second person is, but two of his colleagues and collaborators will be with us next Monday as to talk about Leo, his life, and his contributions to strengthening the left. And then we have many excellent other webinars coming up in following months. So I hope that you'll continue to follow us. And let me also remind you that we're happy to have donations to help cover the costs of this. And you can make your donation through our website, globaljusticecenter.org. Let me thank our team that has been putting these webinars on. They include Gregory Diamant, Liz Mestras, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales. And they've been doing lots of hard work, and we're very open to having suggestions for future webinars. But right now, this is Cliff Durand signing off until next Monday.
Nice seeing you, Michael. It was really good.
Thanks very much for inviting me. It's been
Thank you,
really a good
Michael.
wide-ranging discussion.
Thank you very much, Mike.